day of lectures. How exciting! Very exciting. Quick reminder, we have our hackathon tonight at 7 p.m. There will be boba, there will be music, there will be staff, there will be status center, I don't know. So yeah, we'll be doing fun stuff there. Hopefully you guys can really make some good progress tonight. If you can come, it's a great way to get ready for milestone 2, which is due on Tuesday. That's why it's milestone 2. Remember that. Anyway, so yeah, that's due Tuesday. That's your MVP. And if you don't know what the requirements are for that, I highly recommend looking that up. We posted a note on it, note about it on Piazza, so definitely check that out. Yeah, I think that's all the logistics. Yep. So, I'm Rapine.
I'm Jessica.
And today we're going to be talking about designing for the web. What does that mean?
Yeah, Rapine.
What is that? It's so strange, right, Jessica?
I don't know what it means either. Tell me about it.
Actually, so, context, this is a lecture that we had no idea what we wanted to talk about. So, we just kind of called it some vague title, and now we're just going to talk about some random stuff. So, I hope you enjoy it. But overall, we're going to talk about a few things. We're first going to talk about mobile first design, what that means, how you do it, what are some mindsets about it.
Then we'll be talking about colors and aesthetics. How can you make your website look pretty? What are some tips on that?
We'll dive into some advanced CSS topics, such as special CSS selectors. These are pretty cool things, so you'll see that in a bit.
And finally, we'll be talking about what compiled CSS is. If you've done some Google searches, you might have seen some. We're going to explain what that is and maybe whether or not you should be using it.
Cool. So let's dive into mobile first design. So first of all, if I get a raise your hand, has anyone heard this phrase before? Does anyone know what this is? What is it? Yeah, you first design your website for mobile, so that it looks good for mobile, and then you can expand it for your desktop. Yeah, and that's basically the idea. And the reason we do this is an impressive number. Over half of all web requests, web traffic comes from mobile devices. So basically 1 in every 2 people that are going to visit your website might be looking at it from a phone. And if you don't have a website that's good for a phone, that doesn't look good on a phone or a tablet or something like that, they're basically instantly losing half of the population that you could have using your website. So it's really important nowadays, and lots of people do use mobile-friendly websites or mobile-friendly design so that they can attract more people to use their app. So how do you actually do this? How do you create a UI for all screen sizes? Because it's not just designing for mobile, like a tall, weird-sized screen. It's not just designing for a large desktop screen. It's designing for both, and designing for all kinds of sizes. And so we have here 2 kind of mindsets. One is called responsive web design. The other is called mobile-first web design. Honestly, I think they're kind of the same, but the reason I put this up here is because I really like this picture, because it kind of illustrates my point, in that we have this idea that a web page is essentially content, okay? You guys are conveying some messages, delivering some experiences, producing some content on a web page. And the idea is that no matter what form your UI takes, or no matter what form the user screen takes, the content on it should be relatively the same. And so in responsive web design, you design with the idea that everything should be reusable, components should be responsive, they should change based on what size the screen is. And mobile first is a little bit different. It's the idea that you just create your website for mobile at first, and because you did that, it makes it much easier to go from here to something bigger and adding more detail, instead of starting here and then having to remove more detail at each step. Okay? So yeah, here are some things to consider when making mobile-friendly designs. 1, you want to be using reusable, responsive components. 2, you want to be presenting components in a responsive layout. And 3, you want to maintain an essential look and structure of a website. And so Jessica will talk to you a little bit about these 3 different things.
Yeah. So we're going to start with reusable, responsive components. So first of all, just just to clarify, what does responsive mean? Does anyone want to give a quick shout out about what that means? Yeah, so the answer was when you adjust your screen size and whatnot, it also will change responsively to what you've done. So we're going to talk about what this means first. Reusable responsive components, one of the most easy to understand examples is cards. This is Shannon Pang's website, who is a former member who participated in WebLab. And you can see that on her website, there's these reusable, very similar components with the same layout. This is what it looks like when you hover over them, and they have sort of the same components. To show you how that is responsive, as we change the screen size, they also change in size as well. So they fit your screen size and don't just like run off the screen. To kind of better illustrate this, here's an example of something that's not responsive. It just literally just continues off the page and doesn't do anything different. And this is the AWW Awards website, which hands out awards for our website. It's for good design. So that's nice. Another example is, this is not necessarily a card, but just a layout. For example, on the text website, you can lay out all of these are like components with everything sort of maintaining the same between different pieces. And we can see how on mobile, they also retain the same information, just changing size as well. And so that's kind of an example of how you can make a component that works well in different sizes. So, as you might have seen in the last view, we also have layout. The cards are usually laid out with this sort of grid, and the grid changes as we change the screen size. So we're going to talk about what other components we can also have in a responsive layout. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, I heard someone shout a hamburger menu. It's a hamburger menu. Hamburger menus usually are in the top corner of some website that pulls out a menu. This is the Next House website, and as you can see, we have a nice nav bar at the top, and also a hamburger menu to pull out the menu. But if we click the hamburger menu, we see this set of links, which if you notice, are not the same as the top set of links at all. In fact, this is two different menus. And this does not make sense for the user, because when you expect to click on that hamburger menu, you should see the same thing. And if you go to this website on mobile, and you click the hamburger menu then, it no longer pulls up this set of links, but the ones at the top. So that doesn't make sense, and is confusing to users from device to device. On the other hand, here's an example of a good use of a hamburger menu. Jessica. So if you look at our website, wow, we made this WebLab website. It's beautiful. You'll notice at the top we have a nav bar with about, schedule teams, and when we go to mobile, it all disappears, but instead we get the hamburger menu icon. And the hamburger menu icon, when you click on it, you get the same links back. It's a good use of hamburger menu and how it should work. Wow. So, there's something kind of interesting that happened in the last slide that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about, which is maintaining the essential structure. From the responsive site to the smaller website to your larger or desktop website, it still maintains the same sort of structure, and it's recognizable as the same website. This helps you when you're learning the website first on mobile, and then you go to desktop, and you can be like, oh, I know what this is supposed to be doing. So that's kind of vague, so I'm going to explain this a little bit more. Let's start with this website. This is an official Adidas website. Can someone tell me what's wrong with this?
Nothing.
Wow. There is something wrong with it, because if you look at the mobile website, the menu, which was previously on the left, is now an icon on the right. Just intuitively, this doesn't make sense when you move from one device to another. You expect the menu to remain on the same side. And this is sort of a subconscious and subliminal thing about learnability and how well that you learn it the first time where something is and what it looks like the second time when you see it. So your website should maintain that sort of structure. Here's an example of another website that doesn't do it. If you noticed, initially there was a nav bar at the top. This website is very slow loading, so this GIF's gonna just wait a little bit, and then we're gonna continue. Wow! So if you notice, it goes into a box for a minute, and that box no longer had the menu bar at the top. So even when we're thinking about not even like responsive layouts from your mobile device to your web browser, you should maintain the same sort of structure even when you're scrolling down on a page. Here's an example of a good one. Behance has, this is their website, both the smaller version and also a web desktop version. You'll see that the icons that remain on the left or right stay on the right, no matter which side you're on, which is really useful for users to remember where things are. So your knowledge of how one website looks on one device is the same as your second device. Cool. Does anyone have any questions about the 3 things we just went over? If you would like to see the Adidas website, you go to our slides and click on the first picture of it, you can go to it.
Now, just to quickly recap, because this is an important concept. Remember, we have 3 things that we want to talk about, which is using responsive elements and components, using responsive layouts, and maintaining structure. And so, just to make sure everyone got that, like a card is an example of a responsive component. If you remember in Shannon's website, it scaled by itself at the component level based on the size of the website. A responsive layout is the grid that these cards are on. You can see that that changes based on the size of the website. And then the responsive structure is something that is like these icons, which maintain the same area, but maybe you're losing some things or moving things around into something like a hamburger. So does that make sense to everyone? So yeah, any questions? Cool. So yeah, we're going to move on to colors and aesthetics. So this is actually pretty important in a lot of websites, and it's unfortunately something that sometimes goes under the radar for a lot of people. But basically, I know that a lot of people are like, I'm not aesthetic, give me some tips. Well, unfortunately, there's no way to learn aesthetic. You just kind of have it or you don't. Not joking. There are a lot of cool websites, tools, ideas, tips basically to make your website go a long way. But this is also one of those things that just comes with practice. The more you do it, the better you'll get at design and making your website look pretty. So let's start with one idea, is that you definitely don't want to pick default colors. So note that in CSS, for any color attribute, you can plop in red, blue, green, or something like that. But you don't actually want to pick these often, mostly because they're pretty bright, they're kind of obnoxious. Honestly, they look less obnoxious than normal on here, but especially if you look at the default red on your screen, it's super in your face. It's generally better to use some muted colors. So yeah, before. So you can see the difference. And all I did was just pick a color slider and just drag it a little bit more to the darker side, a little saturated, and you can see already how this feels a little easier on the eyes and feels more material, more flat, more all that fancy modern stuff that you want it to be. Okay? We have another issue here, is that you generally don't want to combine contrasting colors. If you looked at the Adidas website, there's all kinds of crazy stuff going on there. That can be confusing, it can be overwhelming, it might be hard for people to realize what you want to do or look at or interact with. So having less colors in near proximity helps you kind of avoid being overstimulating as a website. So even though these are muted, it can still be a lot to look at. In general, colors and fonts and basically everything you do on a website has some meaning, and you decide what those are. So we're going to go really quickly into how we branded WebLab, because that's a website, it's an app, it's a class, it's a lot of things, it's a graphic identity. And so we did a lot to make sure that there's some consistency here so you guys get used to some ideas that we present to you. So for example, we have a title font, okay, and we always use this lighter, brighter blue. Okay? It stands out, it's bigger, it's just generally a little easier to notice that, hey, this is a title. Versus our body font is Open Sans. That's more simpler font. It's not super aesthetically different from other fonts, whereas Avenir you can see has kind of a wider style. Open Sans looks like the generic body font, and that's on purpose because this is supposed to be just the general content of our presentations. So, and we use a darker blue to make it smaller so that you can tell that this is body. And then finally, for important ideas, we tend to use this red. We also put it in our Avenir title font just to kind of emphasize again that this is important. You should really check this out. This is useful for you to know. And honestly, these 3 rules, we have a few more, but these 3 rules are basically how we structure most of our slides and presentations. And this is also how we structure when we design our web apps. Because you can see that when we were creating our new redesign, Jessica made this nice little handy little palette kind of thing. And basically it tells you all the guidelines that anyone on staff needs to know when they're making something for WebLab, whether it's promotional materials, whether that's a website, whether that's slides. We try to always follow this color scheme, these texts, these sizings, all that stuff. So you can see that this is something that we made before we even kind of made our website, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
So like this is something that you should also be thinking about before you dive deep into your website or get too far in. And so that's an important idea, is that you should pick a color palette and stick to it. And you don't need that many colors. So we only use like 4 here. Bootstrap has a bunch. This is just Bootstrap's default colors. And you can see how they kind of are used. Like I said, color has meaning. In this case, you have the primary blue color, the secondary gray color, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark, white, transparent. So like these are all different ways to convey different messages just by using some colors. And by being consistent with these colors, you help the learnability of your application. Because if you have one warning sign that's yellow, then the next time someone sees a yellow kind of sign on your website, they'll probably know that, okay, this is probably some kind of warning, maybe I'm doing something wrong. This is useful for teaching someone how to use your user interface and give them a good user experience. So yeah, this is an example of the Bootstrap colors. By the way, you can, if you use Bootstrap, you can customize all these. You can also just go ahead and make your own palette. So if you need inspiration for that, I know not everyone is like super like, ooh, this color, 1 saturation higher, 2 value lower, that's the perfect color I want now. So you can go ahead and find some resources online. There's this cool website called Coolors.co. I don't know. COOLORS.co. And basically it kind of auto-generates different color palettes randomly for you. And you can pick them, you can like edit them slightly if you want. You can just kind of randomly shuffle them until you find something you like. Super useful. There's also something called flatUIcolors.com. This is basically, it's kind of crazy. There's like over like 100 different color palettes that are all picked out by like designers. So it's like someone's professional job to pick a color, and then you can use that. So yeah, this is like certified by real designers. So you can pick colors from there if you want. Next up, you want to use a sans serif font. Okay? Don't use serif. It's for newspapers. It's gross. It's just like sans serif font is like often provides a clean, modern UI. So there's a lot of great sans serif fonts, and you can definitely change the style of your website even by sticking to sans serif fonts. By the way, does everyone know what sans serif and serif is? Just if anyone doesn't, serif basically has those little like ornamentations on your text, whereas sans serif is literally without the serifs. So like Times New Roman. Yeah, so that's like right hand is serif, left hand is sans serif. Okay, but yeah, little ornamentation. So Times New Roman is a serif font, whereas like Calibri is a sans serif. So yeah, you can find a lot of these on fonts.google.com. Again, I highly recommend using this resource because they provide you, it's designed for the web, so they provide you fonts that are good for using on the web. They scale with your website. They're good in terms of just like rendering on a screen, as well as they give you nice little links to let you import it directly into your HTML and CSS. You don't even need to download anything per se onto your computer. So yeah, important caveat, you can not use sans serif fonts if it's part of your aesthetic. So this is a website that won last year that was all about like drawing things. And so yeah, if that's what you're going for, then obviously you wanna you can go all out on that aesthetic. Just don't use Comic Sans. Although that's a sans serif font. But anyways, basically yeah, this is an example of a time where you might want to use something that is not just sans serif font. And yeah, this is a different title from the. And this font's actually called Caveat. So next up, Jessica's talking about tips from actual web designers.
Yeah, so we found some like pretty cool tips that someone compiled / a couple that we threw in ourselves that you can also take and look at. We're just going to pull out a couple. This is from a very long Twitter thread that you can also find, and I've linked on the website under resources. So one of the first ones is going off of kind of what we talked about with fonts and branding, aesthetic, look, is that making very simple and small changes can honestly change how your whole website feels. For example, you can just tell by just very small changes of just this button, we have entirely different aesthetics. The 2017 startup look with the gradient like Stripe does, or you have a trendy New York agency of a lot of like more artsy websites. And like going with that, like we gave you some all-encompassing rules about kind of like fonts and whatnot, but also if you do have a certain aesthetic in mind, you can change and bend rules. Rules are slightly meant to be broken. Here are some examples of more like in detailed tips. These are all by Steve Schauber. I think that's how you say his name, so you can find all of these on his Twitter. One of them is, oftentimes you'll probably find yourself using bright colors and white text. This is a very simple readability thing that you can make your text look more readable by just adding a very small text shadow. And it makes everything just pop out just a little bit more, and you won't really notice it either. On the note about colors and how contrast works between a background color and your text itself, this is the color tool by Material Design, made by Google. You can pick colors here, and they will tell you, based off of color contrast standards, what color you should be using for text. For example, this purple color, not purple, color should have white text on it. And for example, this green, so bright, should not have white text, but black. These are some examples of what those kind of decisions can make are. And if you have a hard time telling, you can also go to tools like this to help you. And a note about accessibility and colors is also you may want to keep in mind colorblind people. For example, if you are colorblind, this probably looks the same to you. But if you're not colorblind, you can probably tell that these colors are green, red, and yellow. But for the colorblind with protanopia, they all look the same. So on this note, green and red are not the best colors to use for opposing things, but rather we would suggest blue and orange, which will look different. On this note, we also can talked about like how different fonts can convey different meanings. And this is a sense of hierarchy on your page. You'll have headings, paragraphs, and ways to do that is not only changing the font, changing how bold the font is, changing how dark the font is. For example, Steve Schauber here talks about how the darker color for the headings makes that pop out, and the lighter color for the paragraph text makes that sort of realize that subliminally we're signaling to people what is what in hierarchy. So if I'm scanning this over, I know what to look at. What's important is these headers. And another note about hierarchy, which I think is super useful, we did mention that there's a lot of colors that can signal different things to people, but again, you don't necessarily always want to have all the colors used on the same thing. For example, these do make sense, perhaps, for what colors like pencil. Here's it. Like, it's in red, this can subliminally signal, and this is a cancel or just like an X sort of notion. But all of these colors are conflicting with you. We don't know which one to look at first. They all are super saturated and pop out at you. And instead, we can do something like this, which creates the same hierarchy. We're messaging that the default you should be doing is the brightest one, next. These are all other options that you have, but are less in the hierarchy and are more likely to be less pressed as well. Here's a note about layout. Oftentimes, you'll see websites with icons to bullet different points. Where do I put that, though? Stephen Schauber brings up a good point that you shouldn't necessarily embed it in line with your text. Then it becomes part of the text, and it's kind of hard to pick out blocks. Instead, by doing it like this, we can also very easily tell and scan for based on icons. Your icons should obviously probably mean something and just not be completely disembodied from the rest of the text. So like configuration management has a settings sort of like a settings gear icon that's often used for configuration. If this is a cat, that wouldn't make much sense. But this way I can first scan what the popular topics are by just looking at the icons, getting that super quickly, and then reading headings as well. Well, this sort of obscures where I start and how I scan this page. Another note about scanning pages and stuff is if you have super long forms, you can break things up into chunks. It becomes easily more bite-sized when we have this sort of column format where information is on one side, the form is on the other, and then broken up into several chunks. Makes it more easy and digestible. If you like squint your eyes, you kind of like can tell where everything is over here. Well, if you squint your eyes and look at the one on the left, everything sort of looks like a blur together. You can't really tell what's what. And that's sort of how you can give people things in chunks as well. So you don't have to grab their attention with everything. So all of those tips, and a lot of the tips we gave before, all of the ones by Steve Shocker, are that you can use aesthetic and your layout to also guide your user with what they should do next. Any questions on those tips that we've gone through? Cool. Yeah.
Just a quick thing about this is that basically every single one of these that Jessica just talked about is basically done in your CSS. Just goes to show that there's a lot of power that you have in your CSS, and it means a lot. So one person at least should be really like diving deep into this stuff, because it can really make a difference in your website. Like you can tell based on basically every single example that Steve Shower does that like one is pretty superior to the other, and that's pretty obvious based on like how he conveys the idea, but also just based on how you can look at these things. And they're pretty small changes, but those small changes can do a lot when you add them. What's up?
What are your tips for backgrounds?
Backgrounds meaning colors?
Like either colors or patterns, anything, please.
Sure. So you can talk about this as well. I think in general, the important thing about backgrounds and your main content is to provide some contrast. Because if your main content blends into your background, that's no good. So you can see here we have like dark text on a light background. There's also plenty of websites that have dark themes, which is like dark background on light text. One general tip that I know that both of us subscribe to is don't use plain white or plain black. It's very easy to just have a I'm pretty sure this is not even white. This is like some like very light blue or something like that probably. Your black text or your gray text doesn't have to be like very dark. It can be like some very dark blues and very dark green like that. And those like small, like very small things actually make your website subtly different from like the standard out of the box websites. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, another note on backgrounds is if you look back at forms with chunking, you can also use different backgrounds to help chunk your website out. So like if this is your landing page and you want your basic landing features to all be this, and then details of about here, you often see like this, there's like a background with an image here, and this is often like some sort of gray. You'll see on a lot of like startup websites do this. This basically just chunks out information that this is the portion that grabs your attention. You've got colors, you've got an image, and this usually will grab your attention. And then the next chunk, which visually signals that this is different information, is gray, and it's like lesser content, quote unquote lesser, but more details oftentimes. And this way you can chunk out your website. Another thing is like you often see footers will be a completely different color, and are usually just some sort of dark color or some sort of main contrast to the rest of the page's colors. So that's another way you can also use backgrounds to help make your website more digestible.
And by the way, I just wanted to show something that I just remembered that I've seen before. But you can, I think it's startup website generator. You can just like, yeah, look at this. So you can like just kind of like find websites like these that always have like, yeah, that like main structure of a header bar, like a background image, like 3 big things, quotes, and like a footer. You know, like this is very standard, and you can just refresh this. Or I think if I just click this, actually, it goes to another one. Yeah, so like, you can see like you can just like this is literally all random. Like it's completely randomly generated, but this is basically how a lot of your websites might look like. So that's not a bad thing. Just saying that like this structure exists for a reason. People utilize the structure because it tends to be effective and it can like make your website look modern. But know that it's also definitely like kind of box that you're putting yourself in, because a lot of websites look like this nowadays.
Yeah, it works, but there's that note. Also, our website looks like this too.
Our website looks like this too.
You take a look.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not a terrible thing, but
One note, if you do see like all of these images in the background are not just like, are somewhat, do you subtract?
It's actually really good.
All of the background images are slightly desaturated and the colors are much less. And sometimes the previous one that we just looked at had a filter on it. There you go, here's one with a filter. This helps create just a very visual difference between your text and the background. Just because oftentimes if your background is as bright as your text is, people won't see your text. So.
No one knows hope like hope. No one knows hopes like hope. No. Yeah. Yeah. What's up?
Oh, quick tip, you can just put a transparent rectangle over the picture. Like this one is like a transparent purple rectangle, and it helps you, filter.
There's
Yeah.
also CSS
There's
filters, so you don't have to go through things like that. But they both work.
What's the policy on using images from the internet?
Sure. In general, we don't expect you guys to have everything built from scratch. It's part of web development to use online resources like libraries, code snippets from Stack Overflow. Our general policy is try to source everything that you use. So in your code, make sure you have comments that point to where you got things, whether that's images, things like that. There's also, in general, using specifically images from online, there's a lot of good resources to find what are called royalty-free images or images that are released to the public. I believe you're going to Unsplash.
Yep.
Yeah, this is a really, really useful tool called unsplash.com. And yeah, so these are all free. And basically, they're taken by photographers that really like photography, but don't really care about making that much money on them. And you get really, really, really beautiful, vibrant pictures that you can use for backgrounds and things like that. So if you're looking for sources for background images for your main landing page, this is a pretty good place to do that.
You'll note that if you go to websites that say this is copyrighted, it's copyrighted. Don't use it. Don't pretend it's yours. If, for example, on Unsplash, you'll see it says say thanks, crediting isn't required, but it's appreciated. This is an example of a Creative Commons thing. Oftentimes, Creative Commons pictures will tell you that they are Creative Commons. On that note as well, if you are taking photos yourself, if you're taking pictures of someone in particular and it's obvious it's a person as the focus, you should ask permission. Consent is sexy.
One last thing, you can see that you can embed a credit badge here. That's useful. And also, finally, if you are putting photos in your website, such as nice ones like this, or nice ones especially that you've taken yourself, you might want to think about how big those photos are. Because some photos take a long time to load. If you saw our website a month ago, it took a long time to load because we have a bunch of photos on it. So make sure you compress your photos before necessarily just posting them on your website. So that's something that you can ask us about more about later. Any other questions? No, that's like a plane flying here.
Cool.
So,
Yeah. Sorry, I just downloaded a picture to your computer.
I'll put it on. Cool. So yeah, use aesthetic to guide your user. It's not just about making this pretty, it can be very useful as well. Next up, special CSS selectors. And by special, I just mean things that we haven't talked about yet. The world of CSS is really, really broad. There's lots of cool things. There's, like you mentioned, a few different things you can do in CSS. You have selectors, which tell you what rules you're going to apply, and rules, which tell you what are you going to apply to these selectors. And it's basically impossible to talk about every single rule, every single property that you can change on using CSS. This is just something that you want to see, can I do this using CSS? Do it with Google, and you probably can. But selectors, on the other hand, are a little more manageable, so we'll go through some of these selectors right now. And by the way, this is blatantly ripped from the Mozilla Developer Network docs, so you can easily find these online if you chose to do so. So yeah, quick recap. We have a few different types of selectors that we've talked about so far. The A, P, H1, div, these are type selectors, basically let you select types of elements on your page. Class selectors, you start with the dot and then you give it a class name, and you can select any elements that have that class. And then ID selectors, which you start with the pound symbol, and then you give it an ID name, and and that will select the element on the page with that ID. So now there's others as well. Now what we're going to talk about right now is something called attribute selectors. And this is basically the general catch-all selector that you can use to select based on any attribute. And so the syntax is like this. You use square brackets, and you can basically select things if they have an attribute. You can select things if they have an attribute that equals a certain value. And then you can also filter those attributes based on whether they start with something, end with something, or contain a value. So there's actually quite a robust system here with like string matching and things like that that let you find different elements based on their attribute. So here's a quick example. I know it's a little small, but you can actually find the code on weblab.2/css-attr attribute. And basically, what do we have here? We basically have a couple divs, three divs. And so they all have different IDs. One is hello world, one is hello weblab, and one is hi world. Okay? And so you can see we use these special selectors called attribute selectors. I know that you can still select IDs here. You can also select, like, if you made an attribute called like my type of pie, and it was equal to apple, you could in here write my type of pie equals apple, and it would apply to that. But what we're doing here is a little more complicated. It's a little more fun. Basically, there are special operators in CSS that allow you to select attributes based on certain characteristics. So this particular operator, the caret equals sign, says that, hey, select any element that has this attribute that starts with hello. So anything that has an ID that starts with hello is colored red. So you can see both hello-world and hello-weblab are colored red. The second one says anything that ends with world, underline. So the first one, hello-world, and the third one, hi-world, are both underlined here. And finally, anything that contains -w, star equals is contains, give it a border. And of course, all of these, hello-world, hello-weblab, hi-world, all contain the substring -w, and you can select all of those. And so you can see that you actually can get around selecting multiple elements using a class using this. So if you have like a structure to your IDs, you don't actually need to have classes necessarily to select multiple elements. You can actually do it using substrings of IDs. So it's a pretty cool technique. You don't need to use it, but there are use cases. So here. Next up, CSS combinators. And this is like a subset of selectors or like a use case of selectors. And this kind of lets you select elements in relation to other elements on your page. So you can select elements that are siblings of each other. You can select elements only if they're a child of something or a descendant of something. Quickly how that works, here's one example. There's a plus operator in CSS combinator really. And basically if you do something like h2 plus p, it will select all paragraph elements that directly follow an h2 element. Similarly, the general siblings, these are kind of similar, but this is basically saying has to directly follow an h2, whereas here it can select any span that follows a paragraph in general. So as long as their parent is the same, it will select any span that has a p. There's also child and descendant combinators. Child basically selects any li elements that are in an unordered list. It's actually really important. I'll show you an example of this in a second. And then descendant is basically selects any span anywhere inside a div. So it could be div, paragraph, span, and then that span still counts as inside that div. We will apply these rules to all of them and use the space operator and the greater than operator. So here's a cool example. Let's say you have two types of lists, an unordered list and an ordered list, and you want to style them differently. So normally before this, you might think, hey, I want to style all list items, but then all of these would get the same styling. Another option would be just, hey, okay, maybe I should add a class to all of these, a class to all of these, and then that's how it works. Or maybe you can just style unordered lists or ordered lists, but maybe that's not exactly what you want to do. So what you can do is instead, basically say, hey, any list item that's a child of an unordered list, let's make it blue. Any list item that's a child of an ordered list, let's make it red. And you can see how that exactly works out. So again, lots of cool use cases for these combinators. And you can see this example at web.2/css-com. Cool. We're diving deeper. These are getting complicated. Does anyone have questions on any of those two first off before I move on? Anything about this?
I know we did advanced CSS, but this is like advanced CSS.
Advanced CSS wasn't really advanced. It was just like,
Yeah.
we don't teach you that much CSS because it's hard. Cool. So pseudoclasses. Pseudoclasses are hella cool. So basically they're used to specify a selector that's not directly represented in the HTML in the web page document, the DOM. And you've already seen one. They are using the syntax colon and you add it after whatever you're selecting. So element colon hover says, hey, apply these rules whenever you hover over an element. And so this is pretty cool. But there are a lot of other ones, such as active, focus, and child. That's a really, really cool one. But basically, yeah, you can see like active would be like if you're clicking on something, like a link, that changes the color when you click on it. And links actually already do this, by the way. Input focus, this is like if you have an input in a form, or just like, it can be anything focused, but it's usually used for inputs. Because let's say you have a form and you're like tabbing through the form, you can like highlight the one you're currently on. And by the way, again, it's also already naturally done, but you can customize that. And finally, nth child is really, really nice. It's a really fun kind of thing that's used often for like tables, lists, things like that. And basically, you can apply styles only to every n children in some kind of box. So, for example, this would apply to every single fourth paragraph element in some container. So you could use like little math expressions like for n, or like you could use odd or even. So here's a quick example of these things in action. So again, CSS-pseudo-class. But right here we have an input, okay? And all I said is input colon focus. You can change the background color. So I actually clicked in it right now, so that's why it's red. If I clicked out of it, it wouldn't be red. That's what focus does. This is pretty fun again. So we can use nth child, and actually there's special words called like odd and even. You don't need to do like 2n or 2n plus 1 because they're pretty common. And basically this says every list item that's odd, make it a blue color. Every list item that's even, make it a red color. And so in the HTML, you can see this isn't represented at all. There's no classes here. There's no CSS or any other special elements here. It just automatically applies it to you, to every single odd one and to every single one. So that's really nice. Kind of dynamically updates your page in a cool way. Finally, CSS pseudo-elements. We just talked about pseudo-classes. Now I'm going to talk about pseudo-elements. So these are used to style parts of selected elements, like parts of it, okay? And those parts might be part that's already there. They might be parts that don't even exist in the HTML, and you create those. Just to explain that real quick, we use the double colon syntax for this one, for CSS pseudo-elements. And so, for example, the first line pseudo-element lets you apply styles to only the first line of the paragraph. There's also first letter, there's things like that. Selection's pretty fun. This is like a subtle thing that you can do on your website, but if you like click and drag over some text and you get that default like blue background when you do that, you can actually style that because this is something that CSS lets you do. It's actually crazy. But yeah, so you can like change the background color of the thing that you highlight using this. You can also do something like this. This is actually really cool. It's called a pseudo-element that's being generated after a selected element. So this is saying that after every single A tag, you're creating some new thing. Okay? There's also a before, and so you can do this before and after. And this is a little confusing. This can get pretty complicated, but here's a very simple example of it. So here we have one long paragraph with just a bunch of filler text. And so we've done a few things. First of all, for the first line of every paragraph, we said, hey, turn it red, make it bold. And you can see that actually, that's exactly what it is. The first line turns red and bold. What's really cool is you can actually resize this page and it still only touch the first line. Very dynamic. And if you like stretch it all the way out and everything was on the first line, then it would all be red. There's also something called first letter, which is handy. You can like do this like book effect when you're like reading a first line of the first chapter of a book. You can kind of make the first letter larger, things like that. So that's pretty useful. But here's the cool one is that basically after Pseudoelement, what it does is you give it a content tag if you want, and it basically creates a new element that isn't in the HTML. So you can see nowhere in the HTML do we have this element, but here it shows up after this paragraph tag. And you can see I just did some few things, made it bold, made it uppercase, but you can do any kind of styling or a lot of different style elements. It's a little more restricted on here, but basically it generates it after. And you can also so yeah, sounds pretty complicated. Does anyone have questions about any of those? What's up?
With the after, you make it a link as well, and you make that after.
Yeah, you can do whatever you want.
No.
Wait, you can't?
No.
Wait, you can't do attribute location?
I mean, it takes on whatever the initial element's attributes are. So if the initial element was a link element, then it would be able to be linkable. And it'd go to the same place as the first one. So your after element can't actually add more attributes itself. They're duplicates.
Okay, alright. I'll defer to her. So yeah, so you can. But there's probably workarounds that you can find online that probably let you do similar things. What's up?
Why would you use after when you can just put it in HTML?
We're going to show you something on that later.
So yeah, he asked why would you use after when you can just put it into the HTML. Yeah, we'll show you some cool applications, but also this does it to every single AL or every single PL, right? So let's say you want some kind of icon or something after every single P element or before every single list item. This style does it completely for you, and this is without any sort of templating at all. So that's really useful. Any other questions? So yeah, this sounds pretty complicated, and it is. It can get very complicated, but there's some really, really, really cool things you can do with this. So here's one example. You see this printer icon here? Icons are a really useful thing, by the way. We're not talking about them too much today, but I would highly recommend using icons in your website. What's cool about this printer icon is that it's not an image. It's actually it's just a div, and it's completely made out of CSS. So these are a bunch of cool properties like border and background color and just using positions. And in particular, it uses the before and after Pseudoelements to really create a bunch of things around some main element. And it's creating an icon using that kind of style. And so you can find icons that are completely imageless. These are kind of extra. You don't really need to do this, but it's super fun. You can try building it yourself.
Yeah.
But you really should have a pretty good amount of knowledge about CSS selectors and stuff like that if you want to try something else.
A quick note on that, if you do use before and after pseudo-elements, you'll notice that this one only uses one colon. CSS is still growing and it keeps changing, and this is a rather new thing. And in order to make it back compatible, it uses the old syntax of a single colon. It should be two though. Another note is that content, you'll notice, is mentioned in both, and content actually is required. If you do not have content to nothing or content not specified, your before and after elements won't actually show up.
Some syntax for Pseudoelements. Cool. So yeah, what's up?
You put HTML tags in content.
It will be rendered as text.
Okay.
So no. But again, I think there might be workarounds for this, but I checked online. But yeah, so there's other things you can do. So yeah, this is what I mentioned. You can select things using the nth child. This one I really like. It's really cool. Is that basically we were talking about how to make things mobile friendly, and you can use space more efficiently using a combination of media tags and after and before pseudo-elements. So you can see these are just names or links or something like that, and the idea here is that it's just this is what it looks like in mobile. But as you expand to larger and larger monitors, it adds more and more content. And this is all using after and before tags, or after and before pseudo-elements. It just basically you decide whether when you want to display those after or before elements based on whether the screen size is a certain size using media parts. And so this is a combination of several things that we've already talked about. You can see how that really kind of develops into something that's pretty cool. So yeah, that's that. We're going to move on to compiled CSS. Before that, any other questions?
Can I do
You can what?
the code?
Oh, yeah, before we go there, Jessica's gonna do a really cool interactive workshop, so yes, go for it.
Cool. I'm going to use some of the tags we just talked about to make some fun things, just for the lulz. I am a big CSS buff, so I enjoy doing this. So what we're going to do is I'm going to make a hamburger menu with one div, just to show kind of like how that works. So I can have, is this reasonable? Should I make it larger? Raise your hand if I should make it larger. Okay. Okay, cool. How do I just... Okay, cool. So I'm just going to make a div that's called hamburger. I know. And that will be where I'm going to make my icon. So we'll just move it a little bit higher. So I'll first select this, and I'm going to make, I want my whole element to have, let's say, a width of 100. So that's what we're going to do, width of 100 pixels, height of 100 pixels. And just to show that it's there, we're just going to make a background color of green. Chill. You can see it there. So if I actually want to make the hamburger menu itself, I'm just going to use an after selector actually. So I'm going to do hashtag hamburger to select this object, make an after element, and do content of nothing. Cool. So just to show you where that is, I'm going to give it a width of 100 pixels, height of 20 pixels, and background color of black. Okay, cool. So it's currently below everything. Oh, it's not. Okay, cool. Afters are rendered after your element, so those will be shown above. So I'm going to display. Pain. Cool. So you can see that the after element is now there. And now I'm going to make a bunch of them because a hamburger menu has 3 lines. So I'm just going to make actually a box shadow. If I remember correctly, it's 30 pixels. Oh, it's the other way around. So I'm going to move the box shadow to the right, no pixels. I'm going to move the box shadow down by 40 pixels, and we'll also make it black. So now I've got 2 lines to my hamburger menu, and I can make one more, 0 pixels. I'll move it down 80 pixels. Although, is that even? Nice. And also black. So I made a hamburger menu completely out of non-existent elements, like that. You can also do cool things like, oh, I want to render something when I actually hover over it. So I could be like, oh, hashtag hamburger. When hovered, I want to render the before element, content of below, and display block, position absolute, background color, red, top. Okay, so we're going to render it to the left, or right. I'm pointing different directions that I'm saying, and I apologize. So I'll say to the right, and I want to do it 100 pixels over. And then, let's say, width of 40 pixels. Actually, it's probably going to be larger than that. Height of 40 pixels. Okay, so currently we don't see it because we're not hovering. Okay. And we'll have a border radius of 50%. Wonderful. You can do a lot of weird, funky things. This is just an example of something super simple that doesn't actually mean much. But for example, this is how you can create tooltips. This is not the most beautiful tooltip in the world. You can probably make this better if we added padding of like 0.5 EM, 1 EM. Oh, that's, okay, it's a little sad, but that's fine. You can make things a lot better. If I wanted to, I guess I can make a text align. But as you can see, you can do a lot of different styling for this. If you want to check out something like this, I kind of made a similar thing. If you go to weblab.2/alo, you'll see another pen that if I saved it. Let's see. I'm gonna wait to say goodbye. That does something similar where I have a block where when you hover over it, you get a little tooltip, and this hamburger menu made completely of shadows. So, yeah. One more thing that you can see on this is I created a variable. So CSS has a bunch of crazy things that they added. So you declare variables in root. And in root, I created this variable dash dash height. You need the 2 dashes to declare it as a variable. Otherwise, they'll be confused. And I set the height to 100 pixels. So I can actually change, I have this block here set to a height of whatever this variable is. So if I change this to like 60, I can move left. This block height will also change as well. Another note is we also have something called calculate, which is like this. If you see in here, you can calculate based off of variables and also things together. So if I'm super lazy and I want to add things together that like I don't really want to do, so let's say I don't want to do math and I want to get 20 pixels plus 10 pixels, you can do that. And it will actually calculate this. And you can combine different operators together, or different sizes and scales. So if I don't want to do both pixels, I can also do 1 EM plus 10 pixels, and it will also calculate that math for you. Calculate is very useful, regardless of what you kind of do, but one note is there's spaces between the plus and this thing, because otherwise it won't actually render. This is not parsable CSS. It needs spaces, because it's a little silly. Yeah.
So yeah, cool. Basically, there's a lot of cool things you can do with CSS. Just gotta know how to do.
Yes.
What's the point of making a hamburger menu like that versus just like getting an image of it?
Yeah, so one example is on a couple of websites, they make hamburger menus completely out of that, so they can apply something like CSS transitions, so that when you hover over them, they'll actually morph or change. So by doing things like that, we can allow us to use like a lot of built-in CSS things to animate, transition, and other things as such.
Any questions? Cool. So last thing on the docket for this lecture is compiled CSS. And we bring this up because probably a lot of you are going to see this at some point. You don't have to use it, it's not completely necessary, but it can make your life a lot easier in a lot of different ways. So if we go back all the way to our very first lecture on day 1 of Web Lab, we're going full circle here. We talked about CSS, we talked about some issues with CSS. And if you remember, there were like 4 different things. It was simple but deep, easily gets really big, hard to make mobile friendly, easy to not do well. There's all these different things, okay? And at that point I told you that Bootstrap does a lot of things to solve these problems, okay? And that's true. Bootstrap does do a lot of these things. But there's some more fundamental issues with CSS. And we'll talk about that a little bit. In the sense that it's a very different structure from HTML. If you remember, HTML was nested boxes. CSS was a list of descriptions. And by nature of that, it doesn't really have a good parallel, especially when you're trying to describe elements on your DOM, which are nested inside each other and have this inheritance hierarchy when you use CSS on them. Doesn't really, it's kind of weird to be writing things as a list instead of nested hierarchy. That's kind of strange, and there's no easy way to parallel that. It's sometimes cumbersome to change theme. We just kind of showed you CSS variables, so it's not super true anymore, but a lot of CSS things are recent developments that were kind of as a result of compiled CSS, but we'll get to that in a second. But ignoring CSS variables, it's hard to, like, let's say a lot of CSS, especially old CSS, had like colors that people wanted to apply to a lot of different things. The only way they could do it is just copy and paste it into a lot of different CSS rules. But the next time you wanted to change that CSS, you'd have to now like Control F, like find and replace all of those instances of that color in your CSS. That's kind of annoying and hard. And finally, modularity in files. So like this is an issue. Like, yeah, CSS gets really big really fast, and if you want to make them into smaller components, reuse them, this can be annoying. And like the only solution at the time was to import it into like multiple HTML files and do like complicated things like that. And that's not necessarily the thing you want to do. You don't want to be loading up your HTML with a bunch of CSS imports. So yeah, note that like CSS is constantly updating, which is great. We love this. But that means that a lot of these these two have been like fixed with the introduction of CSS variables and like some import statements. But before these things were created, people were like, how do we deal with these issues? And so that's why compiled CSS exists. And what compiled CSS, there's a couple of them, one called less, one called sass. Most people use sass, less is a little older. But yeah, what compiled CSS is basically you write code in some other kind of language, another kind of file type, and all it is an extended syntax for CSS. And I'll get to that in a second, what that means. And you use a compiler, which is just some program that turns some piece of code into something else. And you use a compiler to translate that not CSS code into CSS code. And what does this let you do? Well, first of all, it's an extended syntax. So what that means is it's the syntax of CSS with other things added on. So in these compiled CSS languages, you can take all of your existing CSS and just toss it into those files, and it'll compile just fine. Actually, what it will do is when you compile it, it'll copy everything from your file, do nothing with it because it's just basic CSS, and just put it into a CSS file. But that's what that is. That doesn't exactly display what the advantages are. So what are the advantages? So it extends the CSS syntax by allowing you to do certain things that addresses the problems we just mentioned. So most importantly, it allows you some nested structure. And what that means is it allows you to have selectors inside selectors and basically represent the HTML more naturally instead of just doing it as a list. And so here's actually an example of that. You can see that we have here some CSS, and here we have the equivalent Sass code. Sass file extensions are SCSS. But yeah, you can see here that basically you'll often be doing this a lot. It's very simply where you want to start identifying elements based on multiple selectors, based on multiple classes, because let's say you want something inside some box to look one way, but that same thing inside another box to look another way, then you often might end up using combinated, which I don't know what this is, just a space. But, idea here is that you can represent that in SCSS in a more natural, hierarchical way without having to repeat your code as much and kind of consolidating it over. So here, basically, we say anything that's in a section have a height 100 pixels, width 100 pixels. Anything that's in a section, but also has a class 1, gets a different height width. And anything in a section, also class 1, and also a button, gets this color. Okay? And so you can see this represents exactly how you should look at something in HTML, but it's more intuitive, more natural, and less cumbersome than writing it all out like this. So yeah, that's the main improvement of compiled CSS over CSS. It also allows for variables. Again, this is something that's now been introduced into regular CSS, so you don't have to use this. But I actually like the CSS, the SCSS syntax for variables. It's very easy. So if you ever see like $signs in CSS, that's an indication that you're not in CSS, you're in SCSS. So yeah, we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, that's useful. You can import basically other CSS into your CSS file, so you can easily make it modular into separate files, and then like use import statements at the top, kind of like how you would in Java or JavaScript or any like other programming language. You can import them in, which is super useful. Also solved in modern CSS, by the way. And again, this is all built on top of basic CSS syntax. So if you're like, you can really just take advantage of the parts you want and just not really have to dive too deep into compiled CSS. You just kind of can write mostly in CSS, and then a few times that you need these advanced features, you can really take advantage of them. Note that I didn't actually mention this, but it's not something that is like pre-built or anything. You have to like set this up in your repository. We're not going to teach you how to do that. It's very simple. You can look it up online.
Or you can find this in during office hours.
Or you can find us at office hours. But yeah, important note is that you will probably find this online. Actually, if any of you have like looked into like Bootstrap, Bootstrap uses SCSS. So that's actually how you can very easily theme Bootstrap, is by customizing the SCSS. Basically, have a giant list of variables that says what are the default values for everything, like spacing, colors, things like that. And if you just change those variables, that'll change the entirety of Bootstrap, letting you use the theme Bootstrap in any way you want. But yeah, this is very common in front-end frameworks. It's very common in code snippets online. And so if you see this, if you see things with $signs, if you see things with nested hierarchy, make sure you can't just copy that into your CSS. It's not going to work. So make sure you guys are aware of that, make sure you guys know what this is, and if you guys make the decision to go down this route, have fun, because it actually can make your code a lot more. So, anyone have questions on compiled CSS? Nope? All right. So in conclusion, yeah, we talked about mobile first design, and how it can go a long way with helping you create responsive and dynamic web apps. We taught you like a very simple kind of 3 ideas that you really want to keep in mind. So just, you can refer back to these slides when you're designing your website, when you're thinking about it. Really, if you even have an inkling of the idea that you want to make this mobile friendly, and by the way, you don't have to do this, we don't require it for this class, but it's a good experience, and if you think about it now, it'll make it easier when you try it again later. But yeah, if you want to go make it mobile friendly, just think about those ideas of using responsive components, responsive layouts, and just like making sure your structure is matched on all components.
We talked about how aesthetics are hard, but there's a lot of tools out there to help you, and following very simple guidelines of just what things should go next to each other, what colors to use, how to pick colors and fonts, can get you pretty far and make your website look very nice and professional and usable.
We talked about how CSS has a lot of depth with all these fancy selectors and tools out there. You can really take advantage of those. You just got to go and learn them.
And finally, I told you about what compiled CSS is, because you'll probably come across it, and how you can use it to structure it, and also when to recognize it and be like, I can't copy and paste that.
And finally, since it's our last lecture here for you guys,
And your pioneers.
there's always some tool that makes your life easier. And basically everything we've talked about today in this course throughout these past couple weeks is just an example of this. So just keep this in your mind as you explore web development. Good luck, and thanks.